Good evening and welcome to our Zoom presentation. My name is Christina Bogdanou. On behalf of the Caloyeras Center for Modern Greek Studies at Loyola Marymount University, I would like to welcome Dr. Evagellos Vallianatos for a presentation of his latest book, Freedom, Clear Thinking and Inspiration from 5,000 Years of Greek History. His book was published a couple of months ago, 2025, and we're very happy to host him today to talk about his book. I want to tell you a little bit about his background. Dr. Vallianatos studied zoology and Greek medieval history at the University of Illinois and received his Ph.D. in modern Greek history from the University of Wisconsin. He did postdoctoral studies in the history of science at Harvard University and worked on Capitol Hill and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Dr. Vallianatos has taught at several universities, and he is the author of hundreds of articles and 7 books, including The Antikythera Mechanism, the story behind the genius of the Greek computer and its demise, that was published in 2021. Before Dr. Vallianatos starts his presentations, I would like to ask you to keep your microphones and cameras off for the duration of the presentation. And feel free to send any questions you may have for the speaker using the chat feature. We'll be monitoring that. And then at the end of the presentation, permitting time, Professor Vallianatos will answer to your questions. And I think we're ready to welcome Professor Vallianatos to today's presentation. Dr. Vallianatos.
Thank you very much, Christina. And of course, I thank the university for giving me this opportunity to speak about this book. Before I get into the pictures and the book, but let me have an introduction about why did I write this book. I have to go back and speak a little bit about myself in order to give the comprehensive sort of background to why I was interested to go to ancient, medieval, and modern Greek history and relate all that history to the problems that we face today in the United States and other democracies. I have been in this country for most of my life. I studied at the universities. I worked in the federal government for 27 years, and I taught at universities. So I think I understand the United States a little bit. At the same time, while I was involved with environmental and historical studies, I kept my interest in Greek history. I mean, my PhD thesis was on Adamadios Korais, whom I consider the father of the Greek Revolution. And after that, I kept doing my own writing and publishing articles. And my experience in the United States convinced me that there is a kind of a trend or maybe a fashion to undermine Greek studies all over the country at the universities because of my research. I mean, I kept reading scholarly books and articles and so on. And I noticed, for instance, that there's a lot of animosity towards Homer. Some scholars reject that Homer even existed and that his epics were nothing else but paramythakia, I mean, fiction stuff, that sort of thing. And that infuriated me because Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of probably not only of Greece, but of all time, loved Homer. And he relied on Homer in his philosophical and scientific studies. And then we come to modern times, and I noticed that the Greek government, for instance, when the 200-year anniversary of the Greek Revolution came up, they put together a panel of foreign scholars, and they began to talk about, let's say, that the Greeks and the Turks got along very fine. Why did they actually revolt against the Turks? And now you have a number of Greeks in the Greek government who I consider more or less like ethnomythenistes, or maybe, I don't know, they don't like being Greek, and they don't support the Greek interest of the country. So the country, if you observe it today versus Turkey, it's like the colony of Turkey. So this is the background. So I wanted to write a history that would reject the dogmas of some of the scholars and present Greek history the way Greeks themselves wrote the history. So when I write a chapter or I write a book, I went straight to the sources. I did not rely very much on secondary material. So my narrative, if you ever read the book, my narrative will be slightly unusual than what you get by reading about Greek history. And besides, this is a book that covers Greek history from the period of the Bronze Age, that is 3000 BCE, which makes it 5,000 years ago, and down to the today. So I have 19 chapters, all examining the various historical periods, and I try to be reasonable. I'm not exaggerating, and I'm not doing things that we should be done. I mean, I rely on the lessons of science. I mean, I'm a scientist to some degree. I have a zoology degree as well, and I spent 27 years of my life with scientists dealing with environmental issues and political issues. So I think it's a comprehensive story, and I urge some of you at least to take a look at the book. So having said that, this is the background, and as I go along, of course, I will elaborate a little bit further to the points that I made. I want to also add two more points about the book. Number one, ancient Greece, when we speak about ancient Greece, we don't speak about a country. We speak about almost 2,500 states, Greek states all over the Mediterranean by the 5th century BC. We have, let's say, the Black Sea or Euxinus Pontus. The coast of that sea were dotted with Greek colonies. You go to Western Europe, we have Greek colonies in Spain and France. We go to North Africa, we have Greek colonies. We go to Italy, and most of Italy, at least from Naples down to Sicily, were all Greek for several hundred years. The Romans themselves call it Magna Graecia, the Greater Greece. So, and then we, of course, and then we have mainland Greece. So the Greeks, to get to know each other was very difficult. So they created the Olympics and so on and so on. So, and the other point about ancient Greece is that it was not a Christian country. They had many gods. They were polytheistic people. The Greeks themselves invented their gods, and they made them beautiful, and they made them with some of the defects of human beings, but nevertheless, they satisfy them. And they even created deities, gods, that were promoting science and technology, which is an explanation why the Greeks were so far advanced in science and technology than anybody else in the Mediterranean for hundreds of years. In fact, they invented what we call science, and Aristotle is a perfect example of that. So how come a people that created so much, suddenly it dropped to the levels of being dependent and becoming a colony of Rome, a colony of Turkey, and a colony now of the great powers, including that of the United States today? So this is the big question that runs through the pages of the book. I start with the goddess Athena, primarily because she was so important to the Athenians, who were the number one Greek polis or city-state in antiquity. Goddess Athena was known not only protector of Athens, but she was a goddess that supported freedom. She protected Athens. And she was also a goddess of democracy. We get this idea from Aeschylus, for instance, who he claims that Athena gave democracy to the Athenians, and I will talk about it. But she was also a goddess of craftsmanship, and she supported women, trying to teach them how to weave and how to be good persons, so to speak. She was a goddess of civilization as well as of science and philosophy. So she was extremely important. Here, I cannot see the right side of my icon, but you can see you have Athena with Prometheus, and they're trying to incorporate intelligence into the kind of a hypothetical human being that they're creating. And Prometheus, according to Aeschylus again, Prometheus actually saved humanity from extinction because he stole the fire of knowledge and craftsmanship, and he gave it to the human beings. And Prometheus is connected with the Greeks. If you accept some of the sayings of mythology, we were actually the grandchildren of Prometheus. Now we see Athena has become a global icon. On the left, the very left side, we can see she's on the emblem of the state of California. Next to her, we have a statue that is a copy of the statue of Phidias that used to be on the Parthenon, and it's in front of the building, the the Parliament of Vienna in Austria. And then we have a statue of Athena that was stolen by the French from Milos, and we have her in the Museum of Louvre. And next to it, I think it's an Athena that pretends to be a goddess of war. And she was, as I said, she was for war to defend freedom. Eros is another great divinity but not in the way that we understand Eros. In this very early creative period, mythology tells us that Eros was the force that kept the universe together. And of course, Aphrodite was supposed to be his mother, but of course, Eros is much older than Aphrodite. But at any rate, Aphrodite, as you can see it, the three pictures on the left are from Evi Sarandea, a Greek artist in the island of Evia. And you can see from the left is the Aphrodite of Milos, and then a Chore from the Acropolis. And finally, you also have the Aphrodite from Cnidos, Phryne of Praxiteles of the 4th century BCE. And then you have, of course, the European image of Aphrodite coming out of the water of the sea. She was very fundamental because men and women have to get together to procreate and therefore to keep the species alive. Zeus was another very fundamental divinity in the Greek pantheon. He was supposed to be the father of the gods, and he was indeed the father of the gods, if you accept mythology. On the very left, we see the statue that existed in Olympia. The Greeks devoted these games, the Olympic Games, and they put Zeus as the sponsor of the games. They honor him with the games. And the idea was to bring the Greeks there so they can get to know each other, plus, of course, exhibit the athletic talent of the best athletes they had all over the country and from all over the Mediterranean. The requirement was that you had to be Greek and speak Greek in order to participate in the Olympics. In the icon in the middle, we have Zeus with his thunderbolt. And the thunderbolt was an extremely powerful weapon, and it was constructed by this Cyclops. And in the picture that I have on the left, we have Apollo, and his head is light up. And then next to him is Hephaestus. Hephaestus was the god that Greeks created in order to support metallurgy and science and technology. And this is the important difference between this religion and other religions. The Greeks, let's say of the 5th, 4th, 3rd century BCE, they look at these deities and they were inspired to actually emulate them and be a good scientist or good metallurgist or so on. So it was a symbiotic relationship that was actually very, very fundamental in the astounding and astonishing progress of Greeks in things of science and technology and civilization. Another very important deity was Dionysus. He was supposed to be the god of wine, but he ended up being a very fundamental god of theater. So the theater of Dionysus was a fundamental institution throughout Greek history. And theater was a political event. Theatro, to see other people, it was always in the open. And there you had ideas from Homer and other tragic poets put on the stage, and you had the exchange between the actors and then the audience looking at all this, and then they had what happened was a cathartic effect. It was a healing effect. And of course, it was a democratic effect, so that the city of Athens, for instance, would pay people to go to the theater. So it's an extremely, extremely important innovation. And finally, we have Demeter here, and this lady, this goddess, was absolutely fundamental. I mean, she was the earth herself. Without her, nothing. I mean, she was the goddess of wheat. Wheat and farming. And farming is fundamental, especially in ancient times, that most Greeks had to earn a living out of a tiny piece of land to raise their food. So she was absolutely fundamental. And now I'm starting a little bit with I want to show you some of the accomplishments of the Greeks. The first one on the left comes from Neolithic period. That's about 7,500 years ago. Look at the beauty of this vase, just extraordinary. And the spiral in the middle, as I see it, is the view they had of the universe, of the cosmos, looking at the sky and so on. And one on the right comes from the island of Milos, but it's actually from Crete. And it's about 1,500 years BCE, that is 3,500 years ago. And it's just beautiful. Look at them. I mean, both of them are exquisite. So we're talking about the ability and the aesthetic quality of this fantastic art thousands of years before our own time. And now we go to the Bronze Age, real Bronze Age, 3000 BC and after. And look at the women with their beautiful hair and model and so on. And the other parts that I display here. I mean, it's just exquisite. So I can say that the Bronze Age lasted for a couple thousand years. And it was the time from 3000 to 1000 that the Greeks developed the foundations of their civilization. That is, you have the beginning of classical, what we later call classical architecture. We have this gorgeous ceramic vessels that they created for typical use, house use, not just to put them in the museum. And they had streets that they were with beautiful stones. And underneath the street, you had running water that came to your house. So they had developed sanitation. All these advances came to England in late 19th century. So these guys, these people, they were almost 4,000 years before the Europeans. They had these accomplishments. Sanitation is absolutely fantastic. I mean, cleanliness and health. This comes from Minoan, Crete. The historians and the archaeologists divide Greek history, especially in this period, into Minoan and Mycenaean. Minoan, they comes from the name of Minos, and he was the son of Zeus, and he controlled Crete in the second millennium BCE. And then in Mycenae, Mycenaean comes from the name Mycenae in Peloponnesus. And here we're still in Minoan. You can see all this beautiful, beautiful art. And here we have in the Mycenaean, that is Mycenae in Peloponnesus. On the left picture, I took it last two years ago. And you can see the exquisite clothes again. These ladies are from Thebes. And then on the right side, you have Oedipus, king of Thebes. Sophocles, of course, wrote the play Oedipus the King. And now, of these pictures, I think the most interesting is the one on the second that shows the early version of Greek writing. It's called Linear B. But this was deciphered, and it was discovered it was a form of early Greek. Simple Greek, but enough to communicate between people. More beautiful subjects that we can see and admire. One of them shows how the soldiers dressed and what the weapons that they used. On the very left side, you have a golden ring, and then, of course, the woman, and then, of course, the excavations in Mycenae. Oh, finally, we have this very, very interesting little story. A couple archaeologists from the University of Cincinnati spent practically their 20 to 30 years in Pylos, next to the palace of Nestor. Nestor was a king who had taken soldiers to the Trojan War, and he was a friend of Odysseus from Ithaca. At any rate, he got back. He was a king of Pylos. So they finally hit the jackpot. In 2015, they discovered a hoard of beautiful artifacts made of silver, gold, and so on. And what we see here was in a stone, a polished stone. And we see this exquisite representation. I mean, this is a fighter is killing two other fighters. Not exactly pleasant, but at any rate, we look at the bodies, we see the architecture, we see the anatomy of the bodies that's supposed to have been a privilege of the art in the classical age. But here we are in 1450 BCE, and we have this exquisite form of art. And Argonautica, with Argonautica, we start with a brief discussion of the epics. The Argonautica was a story told by Apollonius Rhodius, in the 3rd century BCE. He was a librarian in the Library of Alexandria. But in the library, of course, he discovered the early versions of the story of the expedition of these Argonauts that went all the way to the state of Georgia, of what is today Georgia, next to Russia. They crossed the Euxinospodus, the Black Sea, in order to bring back the Chrysomalonderas. And they brought it back, but they also brought much more than that. They brought more knowledge about the areas of the Black Sea that they wanted to go, and eventually they went and they made all their colonies. Plus, they learned something about metallurgy. They advanced their knowledge of metallurgy because it was an area that they had kind of a very interested in advanced metallurgy. So I recommend those of you who have not read Argonautica to take a look at it. It's a beautiful story. This is, of course, the Euxinospodus. And this is just an icon from the Trojan War. The Trojan War did take place. It's not fiction. And you had about 1,000 warships from all over the country, all over Greece, from the Mediterranean. And you have 120,000 Greek soldiers went to Troy. Now, the Trojans were also Greek. So you had the first global Greek civil war that lasted for 10 years. But frankly, Homer describes only the last few days, a couple of weeks before at the end of the 10th year of the war. At any rate, Achilles was from Thessaly, and he was the top gun. I mean, he was the best athlete, the best king and hero that the Greeks had in the Trojan War. Unfortunately, in this picture, what you see him eating meat, and underneath his couch, you have the body of Hector, who was the name of the chief Trojan hero. Of course, Achilles killed Hector because Hector had killed the best friend of Achilles. And the net fact is that war makes people barbarians, and so it's a fact. And we're going to see it a little bit later when we see the Peloponnesian War. Here is the teacher of the Greeks, Homer. When you read Homer, you don't just read a dry story. You read history, you read mythology, you read cosmology, you read physical history, you read something about science, something about technology. And in other words, the Greeks read, sang, and celebrated Homer. And as I said, Aristotle himself used Homer to convince himself that what he was doing in philosophy and science had a precedent, had a source. So he used Homer as a source of knowledge and imitation. So when I see a modern American or European scholar telling me that Homer did not exist, it's really insulting. So at any rate, Homer it used to be, and I hope he continues to be, the teacher of the Greeks. Another great hero, of course, was Heracles. He is supposed to have been the son of Zeus. And this man, this hero, devoted his entire life for the public good. That's what separates him from other heroes and others. And he's supposed to have invented the Olympic Games. So you can see men naked. By the way, the Olympics in Greece, there were naked men competing with each other. And of course, they had Olympics for women where naked women competed with each other. Here is the reality of ancient Greece. You can see, this is a map of the Mediterranean, and you can see, well, you see red was a Greek colony. So you can see all over them, Western Europe, Italy, Northern Africa, the Euxinospodus, that is the Black Sea, all over. It was a gigantic enterprise that took centuries to develop. But because of that, the Greeks became so ingenious and so determined and capable to survive in sometimes a hostile environment. So they've developed things that other people did not. And this is a picture I took out of a video that shows people going and interviewing in a village in Italy, what it used to be Magna Graecia, and people still speak rudimentary form of Greek, and these women are dancing. Now, in mainland Greece, you had two major polis, one Sparta and one Athens. They controlled Peloponnesus and central Greece, and eventually, unfortunately, they came to a civil war, and I will say a couple of things about that. Now, Sparta was a superpower, that is, in terms of military might. They took the boys at the age of 7 and they trained them to become soldiers. And unfortunately, the main defect of that system, the political system, was they had to have people raise food for them. And what do you think they did? They enslaved the descendants of Agamemnon from Mycenae. The Mycenaean people, they enslaved them and they call them ilots, and they raised food for them. So that was a grave injury, a grave problem that kept Sparta armed to the teeth forever and ever. In a Nicaraguan posters, as you can see, we have something about Pythagoras. And Pythagoras was fundamental. He was a philosopher from the island of Samos. He invented all sorts of, he was a great mathematician, cosmologist, astronomer, but he was also a philosopher of great import, and he influenced especially Plato. And through Plato, of course, his name became widespread in post-Plato period. He was also fundamental in the sense of respect and love for the natural world. He urged his students, he created a school in the city of Croton in southern Italy. And he told his followers never to kill a living being. And he was also a vegetarian, so I'd like him for many reasons, including that one. In Athens, we start with Solon. Solon was a kind of a politician, of course. He was a nomothetis, I mean, he was a legislator. And he was brought in an emergency, so he abolished slavery, and he spoke about Sysakhtia, that is to get rid of all the burdens that they had, and he forbade people from making themselves slaves. So he began to do steps that eventually resulted in Athens becoming a full-scale democracy. The person that followed the work of Solon was Clisthenes, and he did a much more extensive work in the 6th century, and he with the jury courts and other divisions. In other words, the whole idea of democracy in Greece was the following: very simple. You had to be able to rule and to be ruled. That is, they picked up the names in a box, from a box, and they say, you Vallianatos, you be in this jury, and you Bogdanou, you become this, and so on. And the people became adjusted to this sort of thing, and they respected each other, and the differences in wealth were not that extraordinary. And the society in general, for especially 150 years in Athens, that they practiced this direct form of democracy, was much better for freedom. They protected themselves, and they became the glory of Hellas for 150 years and more. Now, in Orestia, as I was suggested before, Aeschylus says that Athena gave democracy to Athens, and you can see, and I don't have to read all this, but the elements of democracy, according to Aeschylus, were really fundamental, and they are very much relevant to our own times, because he speaks about the respect of parents and respect of the gods, and the respect and love of the earth, and raise your own food with agriculture, and don't fight any wars, and especially never fight a civil war. This is a fantastic and advice and great wisdom that he gave us and he gave to the planet as a result. And he spoke extensively about freedom and oligarchy and so on. And he said, it's better to live on your feet and die on your feet rather than to live, to continue your life, but be on your knees. You understand the implications of that, especially right now. This is where the Athenians used to get together to make political decisions. I mean, after all, they got together and a citizen got up on this pnyx and he said, I have a problem. And he described the problem and he suggested a solution. And then the citizens would vote yes or no. Should we follow that? And then they published the laws on marble and stone. And there are acres and acres of marble with the Athenian legislation. So there was no excuse for the Athenian citizen not to know what their laws are. How many of us read the laws that they pass in Congress right now? Not many, I don't think. But of course, the antagonism was severe many times, no matter Aeschylus, no matter Homer. Sometimes the Greeks had temptation to resolve their problems by killing each other, and they did, and they had plenty of wars, unfortunately. But then they had a great enemy, the Persians. The Persians in early 5th century, the Persians invaded the country twice. And what we see here is from the first confrontation, and they had a fight in the Marathon. The Marathon in 490 BCE. The Athenians managed to defeat the Persians through a strategic way of fighting. And this philosopher, Heraclitus, in the 6th century, he said, war is the father and king of everything. And regrettably, he is actually true. Consider how many wars have been fought right now as we speak. In 480, the Persians showed up again, and here we have King Leonidas of Sparta with 300 soldiers plus another 700 Greek soldiers. And he was put there in the narrows of Thermopylae to delay the coming of the Persian army from central Greece to Peloponnesus. And a local Greek, for money, for gold, he went to the Persian king and he said, hey, I know how to get your troops in a path around them and surround them. He said, yes, you do? How much do you want? $100. Here is the money. So thanks to this Prodotis or Ephialtes or whatever we can call him, the Persians, of course, killed everybody, including Leonidas. But the delay that his valiant resistance resulted was extraordinarily important for the final victory of the Greeks against the Persians in 480 and 479 BC. Herodotus speaks extensively about that, and he speaks especially about Xerxes. He was a madman, this guy. He said he wanted to have the sun, S-U-N, only to be on his land. So he wanted to expand his empire. He wanted to take over the whole Greece, not just the Greek colonies in Asia Minor. Something happened that is relevant to his character. He had built a bridge, and the bridge was swept aside by the water, and he ordered his soldiers to lash the water 300 times, and then of course, he killed the people that built the bridge. But at any rate, the Persians represented a real threat. They came into Greece, and then different states decided not to fight with the Greeks. They joined the Persians. For instance, Thrace, Macedonia, and Thebes joined the Persians, and they fought against the Greeks. But of course, the Greeks in this case, with the fight of the Persians in 480 BC, they were united. You had the Spartans and the Athenians fighting together. So they formed a league, the Hellenic League, and they took an oath to fight to the last man. And they managed through strategy again, and in the narrow waters between Attica and the island of Salamis, and they defeated the gigantic fleet the Persians put into the waters. Here is the main weapon of Athens, that is a trireme. It was unbeatable, and the Spartans, of course, were fantastic fighters, so they managed to defeat the vast, superior in numbers Persian fleet and soldiers. And now the Athenian general who must be given a prize for his victory, Salamis, was Themistocles. He was a great strategist, but unfortunately, the Athenians ended up to exile him. They exiled him, and he went to Persia. He died in Persia. But definitely, he was a great general. Pericles was another great general of Athens. He was elected repeatedly, and under his supervision, they built the Parthenon, because the Persians, one of the things they did, they burned Athens. Of course, they burned everything on the Acropolis. You have been, I'm sure, to the Acropolis, and you can see this beautiful little temple on the left. This celebrates victory or Nike, and therefore freedom. And on the right side, you have a big picture of the Acropolis with whatever is left there. Parthenon. I mean, the reconstruction of Parthenon has been going on for decades. I wonder why it's taken so long. On the right side, I have cited Melina Mercouri, and some of you may remember her. She said that the Parthenon is the soul of Greece, and I agree with her. The Peloponnesian War happened because the Spartans were very much afraid of the Athenians. After the Persian Wars, there was a golden age in Greece. People from all over the planet, I was going to say, all over the Mediterranean, were going to Athens to study, to work, and they did produce enormous wealth. And the Athenians, they built the Parthenon, said it was a gorgeous, beautiful place with philosophers, people of letters and people of science and so on. But Sparta, unfortunately, stood there with its military might, isolated, so to speak, and she was jealous. And, Thonos really worked up with the Spartans. So they started fighting the Athenians, and for 27 years, they wrecked the country. This is another example of war, that these people becoming barbarians during the war. We're looking at Alcibiades. He was a student of Socrates, and in this picture you can see he's talking to Socrates. And because of a misunderstanding, he went as a general to Syracuse. The Athenians wanted to capture Syracuse in Sicily. So they ordered him to come back to Athens. They were accusing him of doing something against the gods. So instead of going to Athens, he went to Sparta. So he advanced the Spartans how to defeat the Athenians. And then he left Sparta, he went to Persia. And he was telling the Persians, keep funding Greeks, killing Greeks. So this is what I mean. It's just horrendous stuff. We have Thucydides, who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. And this is another Athenian general, Thrasybulus, who restored democracy after the defeat of Athens in 404 BC. Plato, you can spend hours and perhaps months talking about Plato, but here this kind of an image of a cave where people are holed and they look at images that are not real, but they believe them as real. It's a kind of irrelevant to our times because of television and iPhones and so on, that people strike an ideology through fiction or fake knowledge or fake whatever. And then when they face reality, they reject reality because they still hold to the unreal facts. This is in Magna Graecia, of course, in southern Italy, and you can see this is a temple that it's almost like it was built yesterday. And I do, if I go to Greece this summer, I definitely plan to go and see it. It's just a gorgeous form of architecture. And by the way, they called it Concordia, means omonia. Omonia, that is in order to bring Greeks together. I mean, there was that continuous strife among the Greeks, unfortunately. And that really ended up being their doing. So they tried with the Olympics, they tried with the Pan-Hellenic Games, they tried with temples. They did their best, but in the end, and now we just a couple of words about Democritus. This is a man who created the atomic theory. And in a sense, the Greek that I have in front of you, it says, everything is made, the beginnings of everything is out of atoms and in space. And then everything else is hypothetical. It's whatever you want to call it. And he's correct. But unfortunately, this atomic theory in the 20th century was made into atomic bombs and then finally nuclear bombs. That's misuse of science to the extreme. Plato and Aristotle, of course, Plato was teaching Aristotle, and Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, and this is the creation of a kind of a philosopher king to some degree, you might say. and Alexander absorbed the thought of Aristotle, and Aristotle gave him also the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer. He edited it for his pupil, and Alexander unfortunately died at the age of 33, so he didn't do very much, but he started with a kind of Aristotelian version of the cosmos. And on the right side, you have something that says one philosopher to the other. It creates, this is all 4th century, and you have a kind of an empire of knowledge and politics and power. Aristotle was behind all this. He was, in my humble opinion, the greatest philosopher ever. And not only that, but he invented science. It's extraordinary. I mean, this is 4th century philosopher, and he created zoology. I took my first degree in zoology, my first degree in college in zoology. And I did pretty well, but I was not exactly enthusiastic about that. That's why I didn't continue. And later on, when I got in touch with Aristotle, and I began to read his works, especially 2 scientific works, The History of Animals and Parts of Animals. If you read those works, you can understand what we call ecological connections in nature, the relationship of animals to animals, the anatomy, their relationship to human beings, and vice versa, the delicate role they play in the balance of nature. Everything that we talk about today about the environment, Aristotle spoke about it 2,000 years ago. Here you have him. This is a picture I took from the University of Athens, and you can see Aristotle. You can see behind him Alexander the Great, his student, and he's ready to teach him an anatomy lesson. Now Aristotle, Alexander, because of his learning, he started the invasion of Persia, and he finally conquered the whole thing. And here he is. And the Alexandria era, of course, is another era of science and civilization. He created 70 cities in Asia that he called them Alexandrias. And in the city, you had all the institutions of civilization. You had schools, you had libraries, you had theaters. And Asians, if they wanted, they could go there, and if they wanted, they learned Greek. And in fact, many of them did learn Greek. And so if you have a person from Israel who wanted to write a book, he wrote it in Greek, because Greek became the lingua franca of that time for several centuries. Just like English is today, the language that most of us speak and write and so on. One of the students of Aristotle was Ptolemy. And Ptolemy was a general of Alexander. And when Alexander died at the age of 33, Ptolemy became the king of Egypt. And here we have I'm sorry, I should have said a little bit about this fellow, Aristarchus of Samos. Is another philosopher who invented the heliocentric system, theory of matter. He said the Earth is fundamental and we love it, but it's not. The Earth is not at the center of the cosmos. It's the Ilios, the sun, that's at the center of the cosmos. And this is exactly continues to this very day, that the heliocentric system is at the center of our understanding of the heavens. And then the other major figure in science is Archimedes, of course, the greatest scientist ever. In fact, I think modern science is Archimedean. It's just fantastic. I have written extensively about him in the book about the Antikythera mechanism, because he was fundamental, perhaps in the creation even of the gears. Though the gears were invented by another person in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, I think Archimedes improved the gears that became a form of advanced technology. And then as a result, of course, they created the Antikythera mechanism, and I give you just a few pictures of the Antikythera mechanism. It was a mechanism to predict the eclipses of the sun and the moon, including the eclipses, the prediction of the various Pan-Hellenic games. So in that machine, they combine heavens and earth. And this is 2 more pictures from the Antikythera mechanism. And finally, we go to this fellow, Ptolemeus, the 2nd century. He was a great astronomer, mathematician. He wrote a book of mathematical physics, and the Arabs call it Almagest, the best mathematician. And this book educated Arabs and Europeans for centuries in astronomy, in geography, and in mathematics. Now, So I'm talking about here. I quote this person, John Barnett, a scholar from England who wrote a book on early Greek philosophy, and he published it in 1920. If you find the third edition and you read it, you will find this paragraph. It says, science is thinking about the world in the Greek way. That is why science existed only wherever people came in touch with the Greeks. This sounds a little bit too much Greco-centric, but in my humble opinion, this is true. The Greeks invented science because they were polymaths. They loved the natural world. They studied the natural world. They studied their politics. They published their laws. They were law-abiding society. They had, of course, the defect of fighting each other. But aside from that, they were geniuses in many, many ways. You go to Athens now, 3,000 years later, and you look at this temple of the Parthenon, and you say, who created this temple? It's just gorgeous, gorgeous. Unfortunately, all that civilization that we have been talking about went down the drain, more or less. Not all of it, but some. The Roman Emperor, Greece became part of the Roman Empire because the Greeks were fighting each other. The Romans got into Greece and they never left. And as a result of that, Constantine, Emperor Constantine in the 4th century of our own era, he chose the Judaic Christian religion, and he brought it to Greece, and he brought it to all over his own empire. In fact, he expelled all the gods, not just from Greece, but from Rome, from anywhere they existed. And they destroyed the temples. They did all sorts of massive destruction. And this icon gives you an example of what happened, just a tiny example. This woman, you can see her on the left, called Hypatia, she used to teach Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy in a school she had in Alexandria, Egypt. And the bishop was jealous because young men went to her school rather than to his church. So one nice morning, the monks grabbed the woman and tore her to pieces. This is 415. Greek knowledge, of course, did not disappear. Some of it survived. Greek fire is one way. It was a military weapon that was used for centuries in ancient Greece, but it continued throughout the Middle Ages. And here we have another medieval king, Justinian, who created a beautiful church, Saint Sophia, which today, unfortunately, is in Istanbul, Constantinople, Istanbul. And he did away with the school of Plato, that is the Platonic Academy, in 529 AD. And I also say that at the end of the 11th century, 1082, the church, for many reasons, attacked Hellenism, and they published an anathema. And not only they anathematize ancient Greek civilization, they anathematize all those who study Greek civilization, apparently like me. All that decline, unfortunately, brought the Crusaders, and in 1204, they captured Constantinople, they shred Greece. And here I cite a great British historian, Stephen Runciman, who claims this attack against the Greeks and the capture of Constantinople prepared the road for the Turks, and he's absolutely correct. And but during this time, especially the 15th century, before the capture of Constantinople in 1453, you had all the Greek scholars getting out of the country, loaded with manuscripts and going to Italian cities. And one of the greatest scholar and collector of books was this fellow Bessarion. He was a metropolitan who, with the emperor, the Greek emperor then, had decided that they had to unite the churches, that is the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic to unite, so the Pope could convince the Europeans to come on behalf of the Greeks and fight the Turks. It did not work out, unfortunately. The Europeans were too much, they called the Greeks heretics. So the dogmatic nature of Christianity and the differences between the two religions, they were minor, but they had made them large. It prevented them from going to fight for the Greeks, and therefore the Turks capture. But the point about Bessarion is that he brought his vast library and he donated it to Venice. Most of those manuscripts were translated into Latin, and that sparked the Renaissance, the rebirth of ancient Greek learning in science, in philosophy, and so on. After all, the works of Archimedes, without the works of Archimedes, Galileo Galilei would be nothing. He used those works to do what he did. Same thing with Nicolaus Copernicus, the monk from Poland, who started talking about the heliocentric system. He relied on Aristarchus of Samos' work to do what he did, and so on. Here we have, we see the picture of the capture of Constantinople in 1453. As you can imagine, disaster, and murder and mayhem. Again, Stephen Runciman denounces the collapse of this Byzantium, and he says beautiful things about Byzantium, that is medieval Greek empire. It was a ray of light, he says, for 1,000 years. And compared to the neighborhoods, I agree. I don't have any problem. Now we come to modern times of Greece, and I will be very fast so we can talk about all this. I wrote my thesis, as I told you, about Korais, and I cite this book. This book is not supposed to have been written by Korais, but I think it is written by Korais, and I recognize that because of the style and the ideas in the book. And I spent 4 years writing my thesis on this guy, so it's a beautiful book about freedom. And there he describes the conditions, how the Greeks lived under the Turks. And it's a dreadful, dreadful reading to see what they did to the Greeks and how the Greeks made a living, or tried to make a living in that culture and civilization. He says that the animals, the horses of the Turks ate better than the Greeks of that time. I mean, it was preposterous. The Greek Revolution started as a movement. It took several years. It spread all over. It was secret society and patriotism and ancient Greek knowledge that sparked all that. You had Korais in Paris publishing his manuscripts. And Korais, by the way, edited ancient Greek works like those of Aristotle, those of Hippocrates, those of Plutarch. So those books became textbooks in equivalent of elementary school or high schools in Turkey. The Turks did not prevent you to be educated if you had the money to go to school, and they did. And here is one of the heroes of the Greek Revolution, Rigas Phareos, and you can see the flag. The flag, in his flag, he took the club of Heracles, the greatest of the heroes, and he put 3 crosses over so he united Christianity and Hellenism in one nice flag over there. And this is some documents giving the vision of the revolution of 1821. The battles begin. The Turks, of course, continue with their mayhem and hanging, and battles, the destruction, and then the killing of the people of Chios. And this is a young woman, she inherited the property, and she spent every dime she had funding the 2-3 warships against the Turks. More Kolokotronis, Peloponnesus, more battles, more victories. And in Europe, of course, they began to figure out, hey, why are the Greeks revolting? After all, this is the time that the Greeks revolted in 1821. There was something that they called it sacred hierissimachia, sacred union or something between the great powers of Europe, that is Russia, France, and England. So they couldn't understand it, but they were educated Europeans, raised with Greek ideas, so they could understand why these Greeks, the modern Greeks, were revolting against the Ottoman Muslims. And on the left, you see some people collecting money for the revolution in Paris, and on the right side, in England, they are raising a loan for the Greek committee. And we have one of the greatest Philhellenes. Philhellene is a person who loves the Greeks, Philhellenism. And in 1824, Lord Byron, goes to Messaloghi, and regrettably, he dies 3 months later. But Messaloghi during this time becomes the center of the struggle, because the Sultan called up his vassal in Egypt. He said, hey, I need assistance. Come with a huge fleet. So he came with a huge fleet, thousands of soldiers, Egyptians and blacks from Africa, and they invaded Peloponnesus. And they invaded, of course, they attacked Mesologi, and all sorts of slaughters, destruction, massive destruction took place. And that became the center also for Philhellenism, because the more atrocities and the more paintings by Delacroix, the more people got excited, and they volunteered, and they went to Greece, and they fought with the Greeks against the Turks. Here we have something with the Acropolis, and here this picture is just fantastic. I mean, look at, I mean, dramatic to the extreme. As a couple decided to kill themselves and they killed their children, they could not. This is from Misologi, and on the right side it is a picture shows Hellas almost dying, Hellas dying, and that picture was also by Delacroix, and it caused all sorts of emotional impact in Paris and in Europe, and you had, therefore, because of that, eventually the European powers, the Russians, the German, the Russians, the English, and the French, they went to Peloponnesus, and they defeated and they smashed the fleet of the Egyptians and the Turks, and therefore, fundamentally, this is the beginning of independent Greece. And here we have the appointment by the European powers, the first president of Greece, Ioannis Kapodistrias, a man of extraordinary talent. He studied in Italy. He became a doctor, but he never practiced medicine. But he was a fantastic diplomat. He served as the Secretary of State for Russia from 1816 to 1822. He wanted an independent country. He didn't want foreign influence or influence from within, from the people who still thought they lived under the Turks. So as a result of that, the enemies at home and abroad joined in, and they murdered him in 1831. After Kapodistrias, goodbye Greece. And I say why I think he's a great president, a great Greek. He just fantastic. If you look at his writings and what he actually did with legislation, from nothing he created a postal service, he created schools, he created a government, he funded it with his own money, plus money he got from Philhellenes from Helvetia, I mean Switzerland. And he was just a fantastic guy. He was a great But the idea of freedom of death, of course, was very much alive in ancient Greece, and it was picked up during the Greek Revolution and after. The Greeks, they had this advantage of being connected to the ancient Greeks, but they also had the disadvantage of having lived for 400 years under this tyrannical regime of the Turks. And therefore, when it came to the revolution, the first 3 years they did very well, and then they started fighting with each other. In fact, they had 2 civil wars while they were fighting the Turks. And you had people from central Greece, Viotia, going south to Peloponnesus and destroying Peloponnesus like Peloponnesus was not a foreign country. And those warriors, seeing the fleet of the Egyptians coming to Peloponnesus, they did nothing to prevent the destruction. So it was ugly. And this is a picture by one Greek artist, Theodoros Vrizakis, and you can see Hellas with all the people who were protagonists of the Greek Revolution. This man is very important. Makrianis, he was a general in the Greek army. He learned how to write at the age of 30 or 35, and eventually he wrote his memoirs. And what do you think he says? 2 things in the memoirs that struck me at least. One says, look, our ancient ancestors gave you virtues. He's talking to the Europeans. But guess what you do, Europeans? You try to make us slaves. And in this paragraph right here, and I don't want to read it, but what he says, in a sense, is that while they were at the very peak of heroism and winning victories against the Turks, the Europeans, especially the French, they were going and supplying food and munition to the Turks that had run into castles. And he says to them, imagine how far we would have gone if you minded your own business. You left the Turks alone. You left us alone to fight them and win. And regrettably, this is very much the policy that continues to this very day. Yes, we have allies. Yes, we love the Americans. We love the Europeans. But some of them are not exactly Philhellens. And you can see it from the administration running the country of Greece as we speak right now. And they brought a king. They brought a king from Bavaria. And then, of course, eventually they brought another king and so on. Meanwhile, we have this disaster. I'm going very fast now. In 1922, you have disaster in Smyrna after 3 years of fighting the Turks in Asia Minor. And then you have the Germans, finally, the barbarians of barbarians, the Germans. They practically wiped out the country. I mean, I don't remember any German. I was born during the war, but I was not born. I don't remember anybody. But I heard stories from my sister, my mother, and so on. These people were barbarians. They smashed, they would destroy 1,700 villages all over the country. They went to the countryside and they killed the animals so that the peasants, the farmers, would starve to death. They literally almost wiped out the country. And of course, we come to 2020, 2010, 2020 with the debt. I mean, the history of the debt is another big book, but at any rate, the debt who do you have? The European Union, and Greece is part of the European Union, and you have the IMF. And what is the IMF? It's part of the Department of the Treasury of the United States. When I was working on Capitol Hill, I tried to have hearings with not me, but I was working for a congressman. And of course, the congressman at the very end, he said, forget it, Vallianatos, we don't want any hearings of the IMF. At any rate, the IMF and the EU squeezed Greece. They treated Greece like an enemy. And I'm not kidding you. I have been to Greece in 22 to 23, and I saw homeless people that I had never seen before. And the per capita income, or rather, the salary of a regular Greek worker in 2023, while I was visiting, was 750 euros. Made about $800. How are you going to live in Athens if you are in Athens with 800 euros to rent, to buy food, to do all the above this? And I don't understand why they did it. I mean, why they weakened the country. They did exactly what the Stavrophori, the Christians, did to Byzantium in 1204 and 1243. It's just awful, unexcusable, and unforgivable. And finally, we come to what's happening in this country. And I'm raising the question that Greek history and the experience of the Greeks would help the United States to recover some of what's going on right now. And now what we see is a rapid decline of democracy in the United States. I don't need to tell you that. And there was an insurrection in 2021. And yet Americans reelected this very guy who inspired the insurrection. What does that tell you about freedom in the United States? You decide. And now we have 2025. We have this multi-billionaire, Elon Musk. He's cutting down, symbolically, a Greek column that represents democracy and everything else in this country. I mean, it's just horrendous. I'm quoting a federal judge in the New York Times. He says, attacking the rule of law is a prelude to tyranny. This is nothing new. All the Greeks said that, the Greek philosophers, tragic poets say the same thing, and we know that. And this is why I think this book and these ideas are very fundamental to Americans in particular right now, to read and see how they can resist the emergence of tyranny. Because if they allow this tyranny to take roots, forget it. It's going to be quite an upheaval. And I don't like to live in tyranny. Aeschylus said, you better die on your feet rather than live with your knees on the ground. And finally, I have already written another book about it. This is a book that's coming in a couple of months, coming out. It's called Earth on Fire. And here I speak about the environment, especially about climate change. And look at the climate problem in the United States as the number 2 major problem, because the United States, unfortunately, is warming at 68% faster than any other part of the earth. And you never hear that. And where did I get this from? It comes from a government document published in 2023. It's called U.S. Fifth Climate assessment. It was published they had an office in the White House. And you can read that and you can. And finally, the lessons of Greek history. 5,000 years of Greek history inspire for creative thinking about democratic politics and science, and above all, freedom. You know, I lived through 25 years of my life. I worked for the USCPA, and there we were dealing with science. And it was that experience that convinces me that something was not exactly right about what's going on in this country, because I could see that politics overrode science. Many of the decisions that the agency did was not appropriate because they did not pay attention to science. At any rate, these are the reasons why I think the book is important. And having said that, I thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to answer any question that any of you may have.
Thank you, Professor Vallianatos. I know that we have run over, but I think we can spend 5 minutes if there are any questions. Is that okay with you?
No, of course, yeah.
So I don't know if there are any questions from our audience.
I have a question. I don't know if anybody. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, this is Alexandros Oxyzolou. Thank you for a very interesting speech covering thousands of years in 60 minutes. Very impressive. I filled in some voids that I had here and there, but I think for the non-Greeks, I think that was a good lesson. Going back to the Peloponnesian War, and you mentioned, much has been talked about what were the causes of the Peloponnesian War, but I agree with you. Sparta was feeling uncertain, so to speak, with the rise of Athens.
Exactly, yeah.
Nowadays, I think there's a professor at Harvard School of Government, Graham Allison, that revisits the theme of the so-called Thucydides trap, which means that looking at the China analogy with the United States,
Yes.
China being Sparta and so forth, that this happened 16 times in the history of the world, and 12 of those times resulted in war. Your comments on that?
I agree. I mean, I have been to China 3 times, and I gave lectures, and when I had enough Chinese professors, I asked them the following question. I said, why are you imitating the United States so much? And they said, where do you think we got our doctor's degrees? We got it at Wisconsin, at Illinois, at Harvard, at Yale, and so on. So we get back to China and we do exactly what you would already have done in the United States. So they are copying the United States to the T. And they want to become #1 United States, not #2. Now they're #2 United States. So this conflict, I mean, I can understand also Sparta. Sparta was isolated, and I blame Pericles a little bit for that, because Pericles did not take the time to bring Sparta into what he was doing. So, in fact, the Spartans, when they started, just before they started the war, they sent an ambassador, and the ambassador spoke to the Athenians at the border, and they said, we want to talk about and see whether we can resolve the problems we face. And the Athenians, with quite a bit of arrogance, they said, what problems? We have no problems with you. Just go back to Sparta. And the next day, the war started. So the Athenians did not pay attention to the rest of the Greeks because they had reached a level of achievement and power that they ignore the neighbors. They thought they were going to be the school of Hellas, as Pericles said in the speech, the school of Hellas. And they should have been more careful. They should have done more with the Spartans, because they knew that the Spartan was a very, very powerful military power, and they didn't, and therefore we had, unfortunately, that event. And I can understand it in a global basis. We have the same thing. Global powers, superpowers, whatever we call them, superpowers, they are jealous of each other, and they're trying to compete. And especially if you have nuclear weapons, the problem can be extremely life-threatening.
Okay, so I think there are no more questions. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for our audience, for staying with us. And I hope we will see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina.